the sky over the Black Sea suddenly revealed a white trail tearing through the air, like a deadly rip across the fragile canvas of geopolitics, already stretched too thin. The invisible pride of the Russian Air Force, the Su-57 Felon, was wobbling desperately. One of its wings had turned into a torch, flames and black smoke billowing violently into the sky. Through the haze, the red star on its fuselage appeared faintly. It wasn't hit by one but two missiles, both launched from an unknown source. But their flight path was unmistakable. They were standard NATO weaponry. The Su-57 began disintegrating midair, burning metal fragments, rained down over international waters. But just near the Romanian patrol airspace, a NATO member. This was no accident. This was not an unintended incident. For the first time in modern warfare history, a fifth-generation Russian fighter jet had been deliberately shot down by a NATO force. News reached the Kremlin like a thunderbolt. The Russian General Staff headquarters trembled. Even Moscow's toughest generals stood stunned. The red line hadn't just been crossed. It had been completely erased. The question now was no longer if, but when and how. What would Moscow's response be? A proportional retaliation? Or a move that could trigger something, dragging all of Europe and the world into an all-out war? The world held its breath. The doomsday clock ticked one notch closer. Total war, just one decision away. For weeks, even months, the Black Sea was no longer calm. It had turned into a massive powder keg, where even the smallest spark could trigger an explosion. Beyond control, under Washington's command, NATO continuously reinforced its patrol squadrons, naval and air forces along the entire eastern flank, from Estonia in the north down to Romania and Bulgaria in the south. They called it Operation Allied Shield, but Moscow called it a Level 1 provocation. The Kremlin accused NATO of massing troops at its border, violating every unwritten agreement after the Cold War. In response, Russia's Black Sea Fleet did not sit idle. Missile frigates, Kilo-class submarines, and especially Su-30SM and Su-35 fighter jets were continuously scrambled from air bases in Crimea. They carried out intimidating maneuvers, flying dangerously close to NATO warships, locking on with mock radar, playing a deadly game of cat and mouse in the skies and across the sea. But the climax of this scenario was the appearance of a destroyer, a guided missile ship of the Arleigh Burke class, believed to be the USS Donald Cook. The ship was equipped with the advanced Aegis system, conducting a freedom of navigation operation known as FONUP, but it wasn't patrolling far away. It was moving into international waters, but extremely sensitive ones. Right near the area, Russia claimed sovereignty over around the Crimean Peninsula. This American move was like pouring fuel on the fire. And then the climax. A routine cat-and-mouse chase today turned into a deadly hunt. It all began on a gray morning, with visibility. An RC-135 Rivet Joint Reconnaissance Aircraft of the U.S. Air Force, a flying brain worth hundreds of millions of dollars, was on a mission to collect electronic intelligence. It was flying through international airspace, but its flight path brushed against the air defense perimeter that Russia had established around Crimea. To Russia, this was a high-value target not to be ignored. Immediately, a red alert sounded at the Sevastopol airbase. Two Su-35S fighters, Russia's most powerful fourth-generation jets, were ordered to scramble. Like two furious eagles, they soared into the sky, with the mission to intercept and drive away the RC-135. Su-35 pilots are famous for their recklessness. They climbed sharply, closing in dangerously on the... Their approach was aggressive and unprofessional. They circled around, engaging afterburners to show off, constantly painting the radar screen of the American reconnaissance aircraft. Collision and radar lock warnings blared nonstop. Inside the cockpit of the RC-135, the U.S. crew knew things were spiraling out of control, but the U.S. was prepared. At Mikhail Kogalniceanu Air Base in Romania, considered NATO's sword, pointing toward Russia's southwest flank, an alarm also went off. Two F-35A Lightning II jets, the stealth phantoms of the U.S. Air Force, received the order to take off. Their mission, protect high-value assets. The two F-35s quietly left the runway. They did not activate their radar. They flew in complete stealth mode, using electro-optical and passive infrared sensors to observe the battlefield. They flew low, blending with the sea's background noise. The Russian Su-35 pilots, though equipped with powerful Urbisi radars, were completely unaware of the presence of the two stealth hunters. As the two F-35s closed in, they formed an invisible stealth shield between the Su-35s and the RC-135. The Su-35 pilots began to feel that something. Their radar warning systems occasionally flashed strange signals, but they couldn't determine the source. And this was when Russia decided to escalate. They knew the US had F-35s in the area, and to send a message to them, Moscow had only one option left. From a secret base deep inside Russian territory, a Su-57 Felon had already taken off earlier. This was a calculated escalation by Russia, deploying its fifth-generation against the F-35. The arrival of the Su-57 immediately changed the entire situation. The data fusion system on the F-35 instantly detected an although the Su-57's stealth capability was formidable, it could not completely hide from the F-35's networked sensor array. The invisible dogfight between stealth fighters had officially begun. This was not an old-school air battle with machine guns and tight maneuvers. This was a war of electromagnetic waves, of data, and processors making millions of calculations per second. There were no gunshots, only radar pulses sweeping back and forth, trying to pierce the stealth shroud of the enemy. The sky thickened with unbearable tension, perhaps out of overconfidence in its own capability, or following orders to teach the US a lesson. The Su-57 performed a fatal maneuver. It suddenly accelerated, swept past the two Su-35s and pointed its nose straight toward the RC-135. The F-35 systems immediately interpreted this move. It wasn't a warning maneuver. It was an act of missile launch preparation. The F-35 sensors detected movement in the Su-57's internal weapon bay, and its radar had locked tightly onto the RC-135 as the target. Inside the F-35 cockpit, the pilot, authorized under the newly loosened rules of engagement due to the crisis, had only milliseconds to decide. He couldn't afford to lose the RC-135. He couldn't let Russia strike first. A short, decisive command came from Command Control. 2 a.m., 1:20. America's most advanced long-range air-to-air weapons silently left the F-35's internal weapon bay. Two white contrails streaked across the sky at supersonic speed. The Su-57 pilot realized the threat far too late. His warning system screamed. He instantly executed the legendary Cobra maneuver, trying to evade, while activating all electronic warfare systems and launching flares. But it was useless. The Su-57's electronic warfare suite and stealth capability was designed to counter old-generation radars, but it couldn't deceive the network targeting system of the F-35. The AMRAAM missiles, guided by both the F-35's active radar and continuous data updates from the RC-135, ignored all countermeasures. Two successive explosions tore through the sky. The Su-57, the technological pride of Russia, became a fireball, just as we saw at the beginning. The incident ended within seconds, but its consequences were endless. The strategic intent behind this is clear. For NATO and the United States, this was a deliberate show of hard deterrence. They wanted to prove one thing. Russia's stealth technology was not superior, and the F-35 was the true master of the skies. They accepted a calculated risk. They had already prepared for this scenario, and they wanted to redraw the red lines on their own terms. They wanted to send a message. Never threaten NATO's high-value assets. But for Russia, this was an unimaginable shock. Moscow was completely stunned. They believed the Su-57 was untouchable, invincible in conventional encounters. It symbolized Russia's military resurgence. The loss of this expensive aircraft was not just a material blow. It was a direct slap to the nation's military prestige. Their pride, their technological glory, was shattered over the Black Sea by their sworn adversary. To the Kremlin, this was no longer an incident. It was a clear act of war. The cat-and-mouse game was over. The time for diplomacy had passed. The only question remaining inside the Russian General Staff headquarters was, where will we strike back? And with what weapons? The news of the Su-57's downing was not just a shock. It was a political earthquake. The Kremlin trembled, literally. Inside the General Staff's emergency meeting room, the air inside the war room thickened with rage and hostility. The hawkish generals roared furiously, demanding an immediate retaliatory strike, not just proportional, but devastating. They pointed directly at NATO warships in the Black Sea. They demanded an attack, a direct strike on the alliance's command centers. In Brussels, to them, the downing of the Su-57 by the US F-35 was an undeniable declaration of war. But President Putin and the pragmatic strategists understood the truth. A direct attack on NATO would immediately trigger Article 5 of the NATO Charter, the scenario of World War III, a full-scale nuclear war that no one could ever win. They faced an impossible choice: either escalate fully and risk Armageddon, or swallow this humiliating defeat and lose all face. Moscow chose a third option, a proportional retaliation, but unexpected, a punitive strike that would make NATO bleed, regret crossing the red line, but not enough to trigger Article 5. A cold and ruthless retaliation strategy was drawn up within hours. The targets would not be the two F-35s that struck first. They had already returned safely to base, hidden in fortified hangars. Hunting them down inside NATO airspace would be suicidal and would certainly trigger an all-out war. The target had to be symbolic and strategic. Target 1, Mikhail Kogalniceanu Air Base in Romania. This was the nest where the two predatory F-35s had taken off. Striking here meant hitting NATO's eastern flank, a punishment for the nation that allowed its territory to be used for attacks against Russia. Target 2, the Aegis destroyer USS Donald Cook, the ship that provided electronic and air defense support for the entire patrol mission. It was America's eyes and shield in the Black Sea. Striking it meant striking Washington directly in the face. The final order was given. Within just 3 short hours after the Su-57 incident, the Black Sea Fleet and Russia's long-range strategic missile units simultaneously received secret orders. Combat Readiness Level 1. A hypersonic storm was about to begin. From the airspace over Crimea and deep inside Russia, MiG-31K heavy interceptors roared into the sky. They carried no air-to-air missiles. Beneath their bellies hung the Dagger, the KH-47M2 Kinzhal hypersonic missile. At the same time, in a deep and silent stretch of sea, a Yazan-class nuclear attack submarine, a black hole beneath the ocean, quietly moved. The terrifying spectacle began over Romania. 5 Kinzhal missiles were released from MiG-31Ks. At high altitude, they streaked forward at Mach 11, an unimaginable speed. At Mikhail Kogalniceanu Air Base, the radar systems of the U.S. and Romanian Patriot air defenses screamed alerts. Red alarms blared throughout the base. Patriot batteries immediately fired back, launching multiple PAC-3 interceptor missiles. But how could they intercept something traveling 10 times the speed of sound and constantly maneuvering mid-flight? NATO's air defense network was completely overwhelmed. The Patriot missiles soared upward but missed their targets, or were simply too slow. 5 earth-shattering explosions erupted almost simultaneously. The Kinzhals didn't target residential zones. They struck core military infrastructure. The first blast obliterated the main runway. The second destroyed the command and control center. Air traffic control collapsed. The third and fourth explosions leveled the drone hangars housing Reaper and Global Hawk UAVs. The final explosion struck a massive fuel depot, creating a colossal fireball, visible from hundreds of miles away. Mikhail Kogalniceanu Air Base, NATO's sword, was shattered within minutes. The infrastructure damage was absolute. The destruction was total. But the second act unfolded even more dramatically at sea, as the USS Donald Cook was still busy processing data about the attack on the Romanian base. Its advanced Aegis combat system suddenly detected a new threat, a sea-skimming target rushing toward it at Mach 8. From beneath the icy waters, a Yazan-class submarine had launched its invincible weapon, the hypersonic Zircon missile. On board the destroyer Donald Cook, the captain had only seconds, not minutes, but mere seconds, to react and fire back. All firing systems engaged. The Aegis system automatically activated. SM-6 missiles, the fleet's most advanced anti-air interceptors, were launched. At the same time, the Phalanx CIWS point defense system began spinning its barrels, unleashing a wall of 20mm rounds at 4,500 shots per minute. It was chaos on deck. The SM-SIXS streaked upward, calculating intercept vectors, while the phalanx created a dense storm of bullets. But the missile was too fast. It sliced through the wall of fire, piercing the phalanx's defenses like a hot knife through butter. It dodged the SM-6 by mere inches. Then came a terrifying screech, followed by an explosion that shook the entire ship. The Zircon struck the superstructure, right near the spy radar mast. The heat and kinetic energy of the impact tore open a massive hole. The ship didn't sink, but it erupted in flames. The Aegis system was paralyzed. The $2 billion destroyer, the pride of the U.S. Navy, was now a smoking wreck, completely disabled in the middle of the Black Sea. Russia's retaliation was complete, its answer delivered. Not with words, but with Kinzhals and Zircons. The strategic message was clear. Russia had used its unstoppable weapons to prove a point. Even if your F-35s can shoot down our Su-57s, our hypersonic missiles can still pierce through your Patriot shields, and your Aegis systems as well. This marked a new balance of deterrence, a balance forged in blood and steel. Washington's reaction was immediate. They were stunned. Veteran strategists couldn't believe it. The Aegis shield had been breached. Immediately, the USS Gerald R. Ford Carrier Strike Group, then stationed in the Mediterranean, received emergency orders to head straight toward the Black Sea. Meanwhile, in Beijing, Chinese military analysts watched without blinking. They remained silent but took careful notes. For the first time in history, Russia's hypersonic weapons had been tested in real combat against America's best defense systems. The outcome would reshape China's entire strategy. Regarding Taiwan and the South China Sea, the balance had shifted. NATO lost a base. The U.S. lost a warship. Russia lost its Su-57. No one had won. Both sides were bleeding. Russia's hypersonic strike on Romania and the U.S. warship had pushed the crisis to an unthinkable level. It was beyond imagination. In Brussels, at NATO headquarters, the atmosphere was tenser than during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Romania's ambassador, his face pale with fury and fear, formally and publicly requested the activation of Article 5 of the NATO Charter. Their territory had been attacked with strategic weapons. This was no longer a border skirmish. It was a clear act of war by the Russian Federation against a NATO member. The Baltic states and Poland immediately voiced support, demanding a full-scale military response. Immediately, they argued that if NATO failed to act now, the entire meaning of the alliance, the promise of one for all, would collapse. Putin would believe he could strike anyone without punishment. But Paris and Berlin hesitated. They were horrified by the prospect of nuclear war. They understood that if NATO activated Article 5 and struck back on Russian territory, for example, bases in Crimea or deep inland where the Kinzhals were launched, then Moscow would certainly respond with tactical nuclear weapons, and from there, the only path forward would be global annihilation. All eyes turned toward Washington. Only the United States had the military might to lead a counterattack, and only the United States had the political weight to restrain it. Inside the White House Situation Room, the U.S. president faced the worst decision in modern history. Option 1. Invoke Article 5, strike Russia, and start World War III. Option 2. Do nothing, or respond only with economic sanctions, and watch NATO collapse before their eyes, losing all global credibility. Both choices were catastrophic. They needed a third option, and they found one. A decisive, game-changing strike. A full-scale offensive, but completely asymmetric. Washington decided they would not launch direct military attacks on Russian soil. They would not fire a single tomahawk at Crimea. They would not cross the nuclear threshold. Instead, they would unleash a weapon more terrifying than a bomb. In the context of modern warfare, a massive cyber and electronic warfare assault, Operation Prometheus. This strike would not be carried out by aircraft carriers or F-35 fighters. It would be executed by supercomputers at Fort Meade, headquarters of the National Security Agency and U.S. Cyber Command, the United States. Within 12 hours of the attack on the USS Donald Cook, Operation Prometheus was activated. The target wasn't a base or a warship. It was the entire nervous system of Russia's southern military district and its Black Sea fleet. The assault unfolded in 3 devastating waves. The first wave, electronic warfare. EA-18G Growler aircraft took off from the USS Gerald R. Ford, still in the Mediterranean, beyond missile range. ChatGPT.NOI. together with satellites and ground-based systems stationed in Romania and Poland. They simultaneously blinded Russia's entire air defense network. The S-400 and S-500 advanced systems in Crimea and Kaliningrad suddenly became useless. Their radars didn't malfunction in the normal sense. They were deceived. They began detecting thousands of phantom targets, hundreds of non-existent F-35 squadrons. Missile batteries spun wildly, trying to lock onto these ghosts, while real NATO aircraft flew past them unnoticed. Within minutes, Russia's supposedly impenetrable air shield had become a heap of smart scrap metal. The second wave, a massive cyber attack on the Saboni system. This was the killing blow. NSA's elite white hat hacker teams used backdoors they had implanted in Russian systems years earlier and began their operation at the Black Sea Fleet Command Center in Sevastopol. Every screen suddenly went black. Satellite phones went dead. Encrypted communications fell silent. Russia's GLONASS global positioning system across the entire Black Sea region was jammed and began transmitting false coordinates. Russian warships at sea could no longer receive orders. Submarines lost contact with their bases. Ground-based missile units were unable to obtain new target coordinates. Simply put, Russia's southern military district had been decapitated. They had gone deaf, blind, and mute, right at the peak of tension. The third wave, a financial and economic strike. Simultaneously with the cyber and military attack, the U.S. Treasury announced a total digital blockade. They not only expelled Russia from SWIFT, they froze the assets of Russian energy corporations around the world and declared a maritime embargo, banning any vessel that had docked in a Russian port from trading in Europe or the U.S. Russia's wartime economy was being strangled. An analysis of the damage and the shift in the balance of power was now becoming clear. Russia, with its Kinzhals and Zircons, had proven it could destroy hardware. They blew up a runway. They crippled a warship. The U.S., with Operation Prometheus, had proven it could destroy software and operating systems. NATO's losses amounted to billions of dollars. Russia's losses were its entire ability to wage conventional war on its western flank. Russian generals in Moscow were only now realizing the cost. They had won a sword fight, but their opponent had struck back. By paralyzing their entire nervous system, they still had weapons, but no command, no communication, no eyes on the enemy. They could not win a war of total technology against the entire NATO alliance. The shift came swiftly. With the Black Sea Fleet completely paralyzed, a special hotline, a non-nuclear red line, was activated between Washington and Moscow. America's message was crystal clear. We have neutralized your southern military district without firing a single shot on Russian soil. This is our response to Article 5. We can do the same to Moscow. Stop now. The Kremlin, though still maintaining a defiant public face, was forced to face reality. They had lost the Su-57 and now their combat capability in the Black Sea. The price for shooting down the F-35 in retaliation was far too high. The intense 48-hour conflict suddenly came to a halt. Neither side declared victory, and neither accepted defeat. In Brussels, NATO announced that the attack on the Romanian base had been met with an appropriate non-military response. Therefore, Article 5 was not activated in the traditional sense. It was a way to save face, but everyone knew Operation Prometheus was, in fact, the modern embodiment of an Article 5 response. In Moscow, state media loudly proclaimed the Black Sea Fleet's successful test of hypersonic weapons, neutralizing America's Aegis shield and forcing NATO's fleet to retreat. They barely mentioned that their own command systems had been paralyzed. Within 12 hours, a new order had emerged. The Black Sea had officially become a dead zone. Militarily speaking, a new Iron Curtain was drawn across the sea, but this time, it wasn't made of barbed wire and concrete. It was woven from digital code, electronic warfare exclusion zones, and cyber minefields. Both sides had tested each other's red lines, and both had learned the price of crossing them. The Su-57 was destroyed, but so was a NATO base. This hypothetical scenario, however extreme, offered three painful lessons. The first and most obvious lesson: modern warfare is no longer a clash of steel. It's not F-35 versus Su-57, nor Zircon versus Aegis. It's a war of silicon, of networks, of communication, and of political will. Whoever controls cyberspace controls the battlefield. Russia's hypersonic weapons may be the sharpest sword, but that sword is useless if the brain that wields it has been paralyzed by the US. The second lesson, the terrifying fragility of peace. This entire doomsday scenario was sparked by a single miscalculation. One action from an F-35 pilot, or one provocation from a Su-57 pilot, nearly pushed the world to nuclear war. In such a tense environment, the line between self-defense and aggression is thinner than a hair. And the final lesson, the most important one for middle powers. This scenario shows that an arms race, trying to match superpowers by buying carriers to face carriers, or stealth jets to fight stealth jets, is meaningless and ruinous. Real strength lies in asymmetric warfare capability, in command autonomy, in electronic warfare power, in the ability to cripple a stronger enemy without confronting them directly. In the war of giants, the clever ones don't try to become another giant. The clever ones find a way to cut the giant's tendons and blind its eyes. Peace, in the end, remains priceless. But to preserve peace, we must first understand the full brutality of war.